We confuse the feeling of love, which lasts a short period of time, with the end of the honeymoon. Love is the act, not the feeling. When we place ourselves beyond our comfort zone for the sake of the spiritual growth of another person.
This is A Joyful Rebellion, the podcast that explores that moment you realize the life and success you worked so hard to create didn't come with all the fulfillment you thought it would. I'm your host, James Walters, and I want you to be the author of your own story. Each week, I connect with people who inspire bold answers to the question, what do I do now to create a life I love? If you're ready to start answering that question for yourself, you're in the right place. So let's start a joyful rebellion. Love, it can be intoxicating, but staying true to yourself inside of it, that can be the real challenge. Christian de la Huerta is a spiritual teacher, TEDx speaker, and author of the book Conscious Love. Having walked the path from depression and self-loathing to lasting inner peace, he now helps others find their own way forward. And in this conversation, we explore the difference between worldly power and soulful power, how we give ourselves away in relationships, and why true love is less about butterflies and more about showing up. If you've ever felt like you were drifting through life or handing your power over without even realizing it, this episode will challenge you to reclaim it. Christian de la Huerta, thank you for being here on A Joyful Rebellion today.
So happy to be here with you, James.
And we're talking today about relationships and love. And in your info, you say you're one of the least likely people to be talking about that. But as far as I can tell, you've got a brand new book out. It's called Conscious Love and Transforming Our Relationship to Relationships. And so it seems like you've done a fair amount of at least thinking, then writing, and now talking about love and relationships. Where did that journey begin for you?
God, that's a great question. It's been a long journey. Because this book is part of a series that is titled Calling All Heroes. So what does it mean to live a heroic life in the 21st century? A heroic, empowered life. And that's the part that I think that I'm unlikely representative of, because I know the opposite. Like, my adolescence was one long depression with suicidal fantasies. And flash forward to today. So, I know self-doubt, I know self-hatred. And when you flash forward to today, like, don't matter what happens in my life, the details, the circumstances, whether a relationship works out or it doesn't, whether a project succeeds or it fails, quote, never, ever, ever do I question my sense of self. So that is unshakable. That's actually what makes me a good candidate to be speaking about this, because I know what it's like to come out of that. And I know how to help people by the hand to pull themselves out of that state of being.
Yeah, and I know in your past work, when you do speaking, you talk a lot about relationship to power and people's relationship to power, not only their own power, but what they think of as things that are external power. Talk a little bit about your experience with uncovering the truths that you found about power and how that folds into this newest book about relationships, about love.
Yeah, well, I think we all struggle with that word and that concept, even that energy, power. We've been conditioned to believe that it's a bad thing, that it's a negative thing, with quotes like power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And what good human being wants to be corrupted? And we've also witnessed thousands of abuses of power in our lifetimes. All we have to do is turn on the news on any given day and to witness one of them and to hear about one of those, and not to mention all the ones that we've witnessed in our personal lives. And then we've also been conditioned to run away from the emotions. We've labeled the emotions weakness. So when you put all that together, what happens is that we end up giving away our power. We end up settling. We end up saying yes, when inside it's really not okay. It's really a no. But in order to settle for a semblance of acceptance or crumbs of pseudo-love, we override our inner feelings, our dreams, our preferences, and settle for that illusion of quasi-peace and comfort, which I think comfort is highly overrated. But what's interesting about that is that what we weren't told is that quote, power corrupts, Lord Acton was referring specifically to political power, not personal power. So we've gotten confused. We didn't get the whole information about this concept. So what this book is about is how to develop relationships by beginning to understand that there's different kinds of power. So I talk about worldly power or ego power, the way that the world relates to power, and internal power or spiritual power or soulful power, the power that comes from within and is just innate and inherent to each one of us, and it's humble and it doesn't need to prove anything to anybody. I think of a Gandhi or a Gandalf, if you're into the Lord of the Rings, and their simple monastic robes, their sandal feet. From looking at them, you would never know how much power they hold until it's called for, until it's necessary. Then get out of the way.
Yeah.
And that's really the kind of power that lies inside each one of us. If we would only get in touch with it and learn how to express it and how to relate to it in a way that is a match for us, right? So in a way that it doesn't have to be hierarchical, it doesn't have to be abusive or about domination or fear or force or manipulation. It could just be a natural expression of who we are. And so that's the process of what to me is empowerment.
It's so fitting what you mentioned about that quote that was taken out of context about absolute power corrupts absolutely, because so much of our lives, we hear these little nuggets of, quote, wisdom, and they come in these forms of, oh, it was said 1,000 years ago, 150 years ago, it must be true.
Exactly.
But a guest I just had on, she was talking about relationships, but a very different kind. And it was the relationship with money and the type of relationship people can have with money. And she quoted that verse from the Old Testament that says, love of money is the root of all evil. And she said, well, actually, I studied religion in school, and one of my friends went back to the original translation and it said something to the effect of the worship of money.
Yeah.
Causes a lot of misfortune, and it was taken again out of context, but it has been told as being the absolute truth, and people tend to believe things that they're told is the absolute truth. And one of the things I love to do on this podcast is explore how certain types of programming gets us where we are. And where we are is not, and it's different for everyone, right? Sometimes it's school that was the most influential programming. Sometimes it's family unit and all the things we get told there. But then we grow up and we have to figure out things on our own. And there becomes a point where we look around and say, okay, all these things I thought were true, I'm not so sure. And while they got me to a place that maybe is not terrible, I don't know that it got me to a place where I'm really happy and fulfilled. So now what do I do? And that's what this podcast is all about. And it sounds like you came to that point in your own life when it came to thinking about power, when it came to thinking about how that works with relationships. What was it for you where you at least said to yourself, you know what, I need to really think more about this. I need to examine it. And the reason I ask that is because you've written a book about it. And what I've found to be true in all of the books that I've written and the writers that I've talked to have written them, they say, you know, you need to write the book that you most need to read. So I'm guessing there was something that happened in your life, in your past, that brought this book forward into the world for everyone else to enjoy.
That's very insightful. I mean, I can definitely relate to it from a personal perspective, and knowing what it is to feel disempowered, and then knowing how to step into power, how to reclaim our personal power. And I think you're absolutely right that it was a long process of questioning. I think for me, what triggered that initial questioning was I was raised in a very Catholic environment and raised at a time where my culture, I was raised in Cuba, where, at least in the circles, my family, that was considered the one and only truth. And yet, there was a part of me that grew up wanting to be a priest. I think it was an actual vocation, a calling to serve the sacred as I understood it then, to serve humanity. And yet, all the while struggling because I knew that I was gay from a young age, and struggling with just being told by the religion in which I was raised that I was going to burn in hell for eternity, that I was an abomination in the eyes of God. So that's what began the process of questioning for me. And it was a matter of survival, to tell you the truth. I had to work this stuff. In a way, it was a head start, because I think those deep existential questions we all have to face at some point or another, unless we're just running away from ourselves and self-medicating our entire lives. There are questions that need to be asked. Like, who are we and what are we doing here? And what is this life all about? And how do I want to spend the short time that I have on this tiny pebble hurtling through space at thousands of miles per hour? But so, like I said, for me, it was an existential thing. I had to come to terms. And so then, once you start asking those questions, I realized very soon that that system in which I was raised didn't have enough room for me.
Yeah.
And which began a whole other process then of questioning, of re-examining my relationship to the sacred, of asking, developing my own concept about morality. Because if I'm not going to go by teachings that were written thousands of years ago, that were taken out of their cultural and historical context, that were written at a time where women weren't even human, they were not equal, they were property. If I'm not going to base my moral choices about what's right and what's wrong on that, then how do I navigate that? So it's a difficult process. I would say it's even a heroic process for most of us to ask those deep questions. And I'm glad I don't have to do it again, but I'm grateful from current perspective. I'm grateful that I did it at an early age.
Yeah, that's cool. And I want to talk a little bit more about the whole power thing, because when it comes to personal power, for example, I know I've met a lot of people, and I've also been guilty of giving my own power away. I've met a lot of people who give their power away, either through just completely they don't want to think about something, or they will sort of feign not being up to a task and say, okay, you think about it, you do it, I don't care. Or being maybe in a more victim mentality about a circumstance where they chose not to exert some of their power, so they just let whatever happen, and then they complain about it. But for people who are listening right now and thinking, well, I can't think of any example when I do that or when I give up my power, what are some everyday basic things that you've seen people do, you've done yourself? I do myself probably every day, but what are some things that you have talked people through, or scenarios that you've helped people understand where they are giving their own personal power away? Just give us some examples so that folks can relate to just the basic everyday stuff.
I mean, the basic ones that we've all done is overriding our true preferences, our feelings, our desires, in order to settle for an illusion of peace in a relationship. I think every one of us has done that. Deeper ones are when a behavior becomes a pattern, and then we get stuck in these relationship imbalances, and they just don't work. There's so much that goes into every relationship, of course, and the power dynamics are intricate. But when we as a pattern put ourselves or less than, and all stemming from not really valuing who we are, which I think we've also been through that phase, that's when it becomes a problem, is when it becomes a pattern. How many people do we know who are in jobs that are less than fulfilling, to say the least, soul devouring at the very worst? And again, stemming from that not valuing ourselves, stemming from self-doubt, from not really seeing our worth. So we end up settling. We end up saying yes again when inside we feel no. I see it all the time. I see it in relationships and couples and dynamics and professional as well as personal relationships. And I've come to realize that you were asking, like, what is the relationship of power to relationships? Mm-hmm. And I think that is the area where most of us give away our power, is in personal relationships. Also with authority figures like parental bosses, ministers and priests and that kind of thing. But the majority of us, I believe, based on 30 years of doing this kind of work, give away our power in personal, romantic, intimate relationships. So that's what triggered the sequence of the books. The first one is understanding who we are and why we do the things we do, understanding the ego mind, which is the source of all our suffering. And then the logical next step is, all right, if most of us give away our power in relationships, so let me think about that. Let me focus about that. Why is it that most of our relationships end up not working out? Why do we get stuck in these patterns? Because we have a conflicted relationship with that too, with love as well. Part of us really wants it. Part of us wants to be in relationship. And yet it's like, whoa, don't get too close. So we have this kind of ambivalent, come here, but not too close.
Yeah.
relationship. And in many, many cases, we end up sabotaging our relationships even before the get-go by attracting people who are not a match, by falling for people who are not available. They live on the other side of the world. They're already with somebody else. And of course, all of this subconsciously, we don't get up in the morning and decide to do this. But it's because of that underlying fear that if I get into another relationship, I'm going to get hurt. I'm going to be cheated on. I'm going to get abandoned. And so that explains the conflicted relationship with that.
Tell me what you think about this, because I think about our personal power a good bit, actually. And I have had experiences. Some of my biggest regrets in my life were not using the power that I have. But I have noticed when it comes up, the subject of personal power, a lot of people tend to think about it, like you mentioned, the corruption level of it, where one person has power over someone else. So if there's a family dynamic, a lot of times the parent has power over the child and tells them what to do. Or even sometimes that child grows up and they're 40 years old and their parent still thinks they have power of influence over that 40-year-old child, right? But when I think about power, especially personal power, I think of it more like when I grew up and I watched Saturday morning cartoons and you had the Super Friends. And you ever watch that? They were just all these, there was Superman, right? And there was Wonder Woman, and they had all these different powers and they were all totally different. And like the Wonder Twins, one of them could turn into anything in water. One of them could turn into whatever animal they wanted, right? But Superman couldn't do that. So there were a lot of times when Superman was like, okay, hope we can figure this thing out. And one of the Wonder Twins turned into an ice bridge and everyone was saved. Or there was another time Aquaman saved the day because he can do the swim thing and he can't fly like Superman. So I kind of think of personal power that way, where it's not that you're better than, you're not over someone else. You're bringing everything you can, everything you are as a human, and a unique human at that. You can bring it to a relationship that someone else literally can't, because they're not built that way. They don't have those experiences that you have. It doesn't mean you're better than them. It just means you're different. And you have the ability to enhance both of your lives by acknowledging your own power and using it. That's the big thing. One of my regrets, I had the ability to just give my perspective one time to relative. It was an authority figure. So someone I thought, and I was a grown dude at that point. I was in my 30s or 40s, and this person was going through something, and I had the ability to give my perspective. But in my mind, I thought, oh, this person is like 20 years older than me. They've got it figured out. In reality, if they had my perspective, maybe things would have worked out a lot better for them. It had nothing to do with me trying to exert power. It was just I had a power of perspective. They didn't. Exactly. And I chose not to use it, and things didn't go great.
And that's a beautiful example of swallowing our power. Yeah. And it's because of that conditioning, right? It's like, how dare I?
Who am I to speak up?
Yes.
Yeah.
And how many lost opportunities like that one in each of our lives, in every one of our lives.
And when it comes to people you hear from who read your book and they reach out and they're like, hey, this is really cool, and this is how it applied in my own life. Is there a theme you keep hearing over and over? Is there something where they were like, oh yeah, this thing you said on page 115, that's me?
I can't think of a single one thing right now, but everybody relates to the ambivalent relationship to power.
Yeah.
Every one of us does. I haven't found one person who doesn't relate to that, who hasn't at some point overridden our authentic truth in order to fit in, to not rock the boat too much, just for that sake of its acceptance or feeling part of something, whether a family or a business or something. I was so shy as a teenager. So there were many times where I knew the answer in class, but I didn't even raise my hand. Yeah. And I know many other people like that. How many lost opportunities? How many times could we have said yes and gone on a coffee date that we didn't do it because we didn't feel comfortable, or we weren't at our best, or whatever the reason was? We held on to the limited thinking, to the smaller thought. We played small. And yet it's something that's inside each one of us. And again, think of that Gandhi figure. It doesn't need to be this big ego thing. You could be just being yourself, going through life, but just having really clear boundaries and getting clear about what works for you, what doesn't work for you. and having the courage to go for it, to speak your mind, to speak your truth, not in an arrogant, confrontational, rebellious sort of way. It's just like self-expression, being who we are. And I think that's ultimately where our fulfillment lies. I think anybody who's stuck with this conversation this long knows that there isn't any amount of worldly success or any other human out there who's going to make us happy. And it's not their job to. Like, how unfair to put that responsibility on somebody else. You are going to make me happy. Yikes. Yeah. So those are the relationships that are just not going to work. They're doomed to fail if that's how we're approaching them. That's, to me, what is approaching a relationship unconsciously means. Where we think that we approach it with the hope that it's going to complete us, it's going to validate who we are, that it's going to make us happy. Forget it. Not going to happen. So, like, there isn't anybody out there in this universe or any other universe who has the same genetics, the same preferences, the same qualities, the same experiences that make each one of us unique. And if we don't give expression to that, ain't nobody else going to do it. And that's where all fulfillment is to be found, in my perception and my experience.
That is the toughest thing, because got to make it happen. And it's one of those deals where I know I came to a point in my life. This was in my 30s. I was rocking the career, doing all the things. And I kind of came to a realization that so much of my life, I was just sort of floating through. Like, I remember going to meet a friend and I was asking them if they were going to the high school reunion. It was coming up on like 10 or 20 years. I don't remember which big round year it was. And I was like, you going to go to that? And they're like, no, I hated high school. I was like, really? I didn't know that. And I thought back to my own experience and I thought, I just kind of floated through it. I just went with it. I don't remember anything particularly being terrible or really great. People were cool. I kind of hung out with this group. I kind of hung out with that group. I was that go-between person. I was that chameleon. So I thought about that. And then I fast forwarded through college. It's kind of the same deal. I don't remember it being hard or easy. Just got through it. The more I thought about it, I was like, oh shit, like my whole entire life's been this. Like, this is what I've done. That was the point where I said, okay, everything's good, but I'm not creating. Like, there's a book being written and it's got my life on the cover. I don't think I'm the one at the keyboard here. And
that's a good metaphor.
Once I realized that, I was like, okay, I need to be the guy at the keyboard, but how do I do that? A lot of water's gone under the bridge, and I've handed over my power to maybe not people specifically, but just kind of circumstances, just blowing with the breeze. So if there's someone who is listening right now and they're like, ooh, that describes me a little bit. As I always say, and I've discovered this is the truth on this podcast after talking to dozens and almost 100 people now, nothing happens until awareness happens. So once you get awareness of something, like when I thought about floating through life for 4 decades, couldn't do anything until that. So if someone's kind of rubbing up against awareness right now, what would you suggest they do next? What kind of questions should they start asking?
That is definitely the first step, right? Self-awareness opens the door to self-acceptance, which makes self-love possible. And then everything else changes from that. But yeah, it's like, you got to start somewhere. And if you're starting from a place where you're clueless about who you are, which is, I was there, start like asking yourself, like, I mean, ultimately the question is like, who am I? And what are we doing here? What am I doing here? And what do I want to do with this life? But start simple. What do I like? What don't I like? What works for me? What doesn't work for me? Like, if I got the memo from the mothership, you've got 2 years left on this planet. The first year, you get everything out of the way, all the bullet point stuff, all the stuff, the bucket list stuff. And what? Like, what do you really want to do? What makes you come alive? What makes time stop when you're engaged in that? It's going to be different for all of us, and there's no right and there's no wrong. What is the imperative is that we give expression to that. But you're right. Before we give expression to it, we got to know what's there.
Yeah.
And that is the heroic journey of life, and it's one that is worth taking.
You kind of just brought up something in my brain that I think I've danced around the edge of for a little while, but you just brought it to me in a way that I think I can verbalize. So my question is this: do you think it's easier to have this conversation with yourself later in life? And the reason I ask that is because early in life, we're told who we are. Everyone around us tells us who we are. You are a kindergarten student. You are the son of Jane and Joe. You are the brother of, whoever. You want to put a name in there. And so you're told by everyone around you, you are a Catholic, or you are a Baptist, or you are a Muslim. And you grow up, okay, sure. Yeah, I'm all this stuff. I got a big resume so far. I'm a brother, I'm a son, I'm all these things. And then you grow up and your next thing you know, you're a fifth grader. And then you grow up a little more and you're a football player, or you're a basketball player, a volleyball player. So you've got these identities. Everyone around you is kind of telling you, and you haven't had input yet necessarily. Maybe back when you were 12, you got out the colored pencils and you got out the pen and you were like, I am an artist. Cool. I like art. This is fun. But really, that's limited in a lot of ways. So I can see how people would maybe give up power they didn't know they had just because they never sat still long enough to really think about, okay, who am I? That was never encouraged. No one gets the 10-year-olds together and says, okay, I want you to close your eyes and think about who you really are. So that spurs on the question, do you think this conversation is easier to have, or maybe more important to have later in life? What do you think about that?
I think it flows probably, after we've lived long enough and had enough heartbreak and enough of experiences in life that we begin to ask the questions, the hard questions. Yeah. And that's the part that I'm grateful, that I had to face myself early in life. I think in a way I got a head start because of that. It was not an enviable adolescence. Like I said, it was one long depression, but a lot of good came from that, of asking those inevitable questions that we all have to ask at some point. And I suppose a lot of people don't, but I think the only way you go through life without asking those deep questions is you have to self-medicate. Right? You have to self-medicate, whether you're using substances or food or work or gaming or just whatever it is that you're using to not think and to run away from your feelings. And that's not a good strategy, because that stuff is not going to go away. It's only going to fester under the surface and bite you in the butt at some point.
Yeah.
There's not many things that I'm dogmatic about. And maybe I'm not dogmatic, as if you showed me a different way of holding it, I'm open to entertaining it. But if you want to be free, if you want to be in your power, there's three things that I just don't see a way around. One of them is what we're talking about, like going within, self-awareness. Who are we? What makes me do the things that I do? I don't see any way around that. The second one you also alluded to, which is the victim card, right? Tearing up the victim card. And to me, that's the hardest one. That's the one that over 3 decades of doing this work, I think that's what most of us struggle with the most. And here's the way that makes it doable, right? Because it's really hard. As long as we're holding somebody else, if mom hadn't done this, or if daddy had been there, or if the system, if there wasn't racism or homophobia or whatever, right? As long as we're holding someone or something outside of ourselves responsible for our state of being, for our happiness, we just gave our power away completely. And it's not to deny that things happen that shouldn't have happened. And I'm really sorry about the stuff that happened and the horrible things that human beings do to each other. And life is tough. Like, life is tough. I'm not denying any of that. And if you want to be free, you can't be stuck in that. Because as long as we're holding them over the fire for what they did or didn't do, our hand is also getting burnt. And so no matter what happened in the past, no matter what happens in the future, we always get to choose how we show up in response. And that little reframe right there pops us out of victim mode.
Yeah.
Right? Without denying the past, acknowledging the stuff that happened, but at saying, all right, what are you going to do about it? How are you going to show up in response to that? Otherwise, we get stuck in victim mode. And related to that, the third thing that I don't see a way around is forgiveness. For the same reason, because as long as we're holding somebody over the fire for what they did or didn't do, our hands also getting burned.
I like that analogy. It's very easy to follow. No one wants to get burned. Yeah. Well, before you wrote a book called Awakening the Soul of Power, it speaks a lot to women. I want to talk about what it is that you discovered about women and their power, giving up their power, reclaiming their power. And it also has a section for men. So talk a little bit about what you discovered through writing that book.
Well, they're both for everybody. We all struggle with issues around love and power. But the reason that I dedicated the Power Book to women is because I believe that the single most important thing that needs to happen in the world is the empowerment of women. And it's not to idealize women, it's not to put women up on a pedestal, it's not to give women more crap that they have to clean up in this mess that we have made collectively. It's because as a world, as a species, we've been running so off balance between the masculine and the feminine energies. And everywhere else in the cosmos, as far as I know, they're equal, right? But in this little planet, we have turned the feminine into less than, into weakness, and creating problems for all of us. It's really interesting that the patriarchal system doesn't work for women, obviously. But the thing is that it also doesn't work for men. When we look at suicide statistics in the US, three quarters of the suicides are committed by middle-aged white men. That is still the group that I think pretty clearly owns the majority of the power in this world. And what is that, right? That doesn't make sense. It would make sense that the group that holds the most power has the most benefits. And yet that is the group that has taken their life disproportionately, considerably. And so I think it's just we've gotten into this twisted, confused, limited, and limiting understanding of what it means to be a man and of masculinity. It's not fulfilling or working for anybody. Yeah. And so part of what I did in the Power Book is I have a chapter that's dedicated specifically to men. It's like, what does it mean to be a man in the 21st century? Because the thing is that women have been claiming their powers. We're not up to equal yet anywhere in the world, maybe some of the Scandinavian countries. But women, like in this country, I think the numbers are from 2018, 19, when I was researching the Power Book. In 40% of heterosexual households, the woman is now making more than the man. So she's bringing in more money than the man. For many men whose identity was to be the provider, then, sends them into crisis. Wait a minute, who am I if I'm not that provider? Yeah. So part of what I did in that chapter is redefine some of these archetypal roles that we identify with being a man and expand them.
Gotcha.
All right. Maybe you're not the provider in the sense of your bank account, but what else can you provide, right? Can you provide stability? Can you provide security? Can you provide a safe environment in which the family, your kids, your spouse can blossom and become the most that they can possibly be? That is priceless. That is much more important and consequential than the size of your bank account. And to expand what I said about the importance of the women's empowerment thing, is that when women are in 50% of power in this world, we don't want to go back to a matriarchal system, but we want balance. And when women are in 50% of power, we're going to have a very different relationship to war and poverty and hunger and social justice, to education, to how we treat the environment, to all of it. So that's why strategically I dedicated that book to women.
It is an imbalance, and you just have to look around the world to see how imbalanced it can be. The biggest example I see on social media, because I follow this account on Instagram, I think it's something about history, and it just posts historical pictures. Like, this is what London looked like back in the 18 whatever. So it doesn't really have a political agenda, anything like that I can tell. But it posts photos from the 70s of Iran and ladies laying on the beach in bikinis and having a great time, ladies in miniskirts going out shopping. And you're like, really? Wow, okay. That's kind of cool. And then it posts one from maybe 5 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, and it's the fully covered. It's exactly what you would think if you were going to flip on the news and see images of Iran today. It's what I've grown up with basically most of my life, because I think the revolution happened when I was 5 there. So it was like, whoa, okay, this was a very different world for women versus men back in the day, and it didn't get balanced. It didn't get improved whatsoever. And we kind of tend to think of history as, okay, incremental improvements. That has not been the case everywhere, for sure.
I think it's sort of the pendulum thing.
That's true. Okay. Yeah.
And sometimes it feels like 2 steps forward and then there's a reaction. So
and then the pendulum just kind of hangs over. It gets stuck for a minute and you're like, whoa, when's that thing coming back?
Yeah. I mean, and with all the respect, like I honor all the religious traditions, even if I'm not individually fed by them or don't subscribe to them, but I honor anybody's right to believe whatever. And I've spoken to some women who wear the veils and the burqas, and to them, it's kind of, let's say, it's not all bad. It's like there's a sense of anonymity that comes with it that I appreciate. But my perspective is like, are you kidding me? Like a woman had covered her beauty so that a man is not going to be tempted. Is like, for the guys, is like, grow up. Manage your feelings. Like manage your impulses.
Manage your feelings. Yes. Yeah, dude.
Seriously.
Yeah.
And speaking of the emotions, that's the other part where men are paying a price. When we label the emotions weakness, little boys don't cry. What is that? Well, it's something that is just an emotion. An emotion isn't strength. It is not weakness. It's not good. It's not bad. It's just energy coursing through our body. How we express that emotion, depending on that, it has a good or not so good effect. But the emotion itself is just pure energy. And we, like we watch a 2-year-old having a total temper tantrum, a total meltdown. A minute later, they're playing like if nothing happened. So they're having their emotions fully, then they can move on to the next emotion. We get into trouble with emotions because we stuff them. We swallow them. And especially men, right? Because we have been conditioned to feel is bad. Because somewhere along the way, somebody decided that the feminine is less than a weakness. So to feel means that you're weak. It's like, wait a minute, if you want to talk strength, courage, resilience, let's talk about the power of creation that resides in a female body and begin to turn everything upside down, where women have much more of a tolerance for pain and resilience that male bodies do. Yet we've gotten so twisted about that. And what happens is we suppress the emotions, we suppress anger, it turns into rage. And we walk around like raging cauldrons exploding inappropriately because we haven't really fully expressed that. And we suppress and run away from sadness, and it congeals and turns into depression. So not that we should go around like 2-year-olds having temper tantrums, but we need to learn how to feel our emotions and learn how to communicate them responsibly.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons that impacts longevity too, because those emotions have to go somewhere. So either we suppress and we suppress and we suppress, and then the next unfortunate soul says something to us the wrong way, and we explode. Or suppress, and then those emotions start seeping out and showing up as illness, cancer, heart attacks, ulcers. And I think that's one of the reasons why women outlive men by 5 years in the U.S., by 7 years globally.
Because they don't get it all pent up as much. Guys, don't hold it in. I don't know what that looks like in your day-to-day, but just like process the thing, get it processed, and come back to, it's that mind like water thing. The water you throw in a big pebble and you get big ripples. You throw in a little pebble, you get a little ripple, but you just come back to the plain surface. And that's what we all shoot for. We don't do it very elegantly, but that would be the ideal goal.
Yeah, exactly.
I want to circle back to your latest book, Conscious Love. What would you say is the arc there? Like if someone read it and they came to you and said, oh man, this book it's about love, it's about relationships, but it's really about, and then you'd fill in the blank from there. What would you say that is, that theme?
I think the subtitle says it, transforming our relationship to relationships.
Yeah.
So approaching relationships in a different way, in a way that they actually have a chance of working. So part of what I did in that book is come up with 10 challenges, 10 areas where we get stuck in relationships. And I talk about that and provide solutions. For example, one of them we already spoke about. If we're approaching the relationship with the expectation that it's going to fulfill us, that it's going to be our source of happiness, forget it, right? So not a good way to approach a relationship. Confusing the feeling of love with the actual emotion of love. And this is paraphrasing Scott Peck from The Road Less Traveled. We confuse that feeling of being in love, which is designed to be temporary. It'll last maybe 3 months, maybe 6, maybe 9 if you haven't moved in together. Yet, because at some point, once they squeeze the toothpaper from the wrong end or they do the toilet paper wrong, which everybody should know this is the correct way,
right,
then everything comes up, right? Yeah. Where in that initial honeymoon phase, the ego boundaries that keep us separate kind of dissipate, right? So we feel like at one with. Before I had practices like meditation or breath work, the only time that I could quiet my mind and pop out of myself was making love. When I became one with someone else. And yet part of that ego identity is so strong, which is both a huge leap in evolution. As far as we know, we're the only species that has a sense of self, like that sense of I-ness. That's what ego means, I in Latin. This is Christian, that's James, right? It's both a helpful illusion and the source of all our suffering. And that's why I start both books with understanding the ego, particularly the power book. Because if we want to have relationships that have a chance of working, if we want to have a sense of personal empowerment, a life that is filled with purpose, with meaning, we have to understand what that ego construct is, what that part of us is. And we don't have time to get into it. There's a lot to say about it. There's a lot of misunderstanding about it. Most of us who know the word will think arrogance, inflated sense of self, and it is that for sure, but it's a whole more than that. Lots more to say about the ego part of us. As far as we know, like I started to say, we're the only species that has a sense of self. Ken Wilber, who writes about this stuff, talks about how humanity at one point, we were at one with all of creation, just like the other species. As far as we know, there's some theories about the dolphins and the whales and the elephants and the higher primates having a sense of who they are, but we don't know. We'll make some assumptions, like if you put a dog or a cat in front of a mirror, they interact with that image as if it was another dog or cat. If you put a chimp or a gorilla in front of a mirror and you put ash on their shoulder, at some point they'll go like this. So we know that they know that that's them in the image. But to jump from that to a sense of self, we can't do that. We don't know how they think about themselves. So it's interesting that Ken Wilber talks about when that ego, that sense of separate individual personality evolved in humans, that was then mythologized all over the planet as the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. Because that's when we lost our sense of connectedness. And we have both the upside, remember, it's one of the reasons we're so successful is we have a sense of separate self, and there's a huge price to pay for that. And now we can have abandonment issues. We can feel lonely, we can feel depressed, we get stuck in our own mortality considering that. So both the source of all our suffering and a huge leap in evolution.
Wow, that's true. I haven't gotten to go down these rabbit holes in quite a while with anyone, especially not recording it. So I appreciate that. And I appreciate your book, Conscious Love, because something you said just reminded me of, all of those things we were talking about before, just kind of floating through life. The top word on your book is conscious. So if you're changing your relationship to relationships, you've got to be conscious about it. You've got to do it with a purpose, not just, I fell in love and everything's great. That happens in movies, but I don't know how much that happens out here where we all operate.
Yeah, and I got totally sidetracked because we finished the thought about Peg. So we confused the feeling of love, which lasts a short period of time, with the end of the honeymoon. And he says that the end of the honeymoon is actually when the work of real loving begins. Once that illusionary phase where the other person can do no wrong, that's the honeymoon phase. Then once reality hits in, most of us bail and we go off in search of greener pastures. But he says that is the point where the work of real loving begins. Okay. And he defines love like this. Love is the act, not the feeling. When we place ourselves beyond our comfort zone for the sake of the spiritual growth of another person.
Okay.
And think about, love is not always going to feel good. Think about disciplining a child. No, you can't have more ice cream. Or no, you can't run into that busy street. It doesn't feel good to discipline a child, but it's an act of love. We're doing it for their sake, for their good. So if love is not that emotion, that feeling, then what is it? And that's what he defines as an act, when we have to go beyond our boundaries or comfort for the sake of someone else.
That's a really good thought to end on, because we've talked a lot about some of the theories behind relationships and love, but to talk about what it is, the definition. I love definitions. I think it's helpful for everybody to understand what we're all talking about. So love is an act. We can talk about the feelings all day long, but feelings come and go, right? Just like you said, the honeymoon period, the feeling may not be there like it was a few weeks in, but still the love can get stronger and stronger through action. So thank you for that, Christian. This has been a great conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time to come on A Joyful Rebellion today.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed the conversations. You had great questions. I love the back and forth. It was stimulating and fun and interesting. So thank you so much for having me on the show.
Absolutely. And I've got your website, soulfulpower.com. I got it up here, got it in the show notes. So if anyone wants to get your new book, see a lot more of what you offer, they can hit you up there. And I'll look forward to getting feedback from our conversation from people who listen. DM me if you got something to say. I want to hear what people listening are thinking. Thanks for joining me today. If something in this episode stirred something in you, don't keep it to yourself. Screenshot it and tag me, or DM me on the socials, send smoke signals, whatever works. I want to know what you're plotting. This show isn't just about listening. It's about building something real together. So I hope to hear from you soon, and I'll be right here next week when you're ready to keep the rebellion going.